Comrades, listen closely, for if you do not hear the truth today, the chains you wear will only tighten tomorrow. You have been told that society functions through your obedience. You have been taught that power belongs to those who possess capital. You have been conditioned to believe that the world as it is, this world of exploitation, inequality, and silent suffering is natural, inevitable, unchangeable. But nothing could be further from the truth. The structure of this society is not a divine order. It is not fate. It is not destiny. It is a system constructed, brick by brick, upon the labor of those who receive the least from it. It is an edifice raised by the hands of millions, yet owned by a handful who benefit from the alienation of those very hands. And so I stand before you to declare a truth long buried beneath the rubble of capitalist ideology. Within every worker lies a sleeping giant, an immense historical power waiting to awaken and reclaim the world it has created. Silence is not merely the absence of speech. In a society built upon hierarchy, exploitation, and the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, silence becomes a weapon, but not one used by the oppressed. It is the quiet that sustains power, the stillness that allows injustice to operate without interruption, the forced muteness that turns human beings into passive instruments for someone else's profit. The system in which you live depends on this silence with a precision more exact than any machine you labor upon. It requires that you witness your own exploitation without naming it, that you endure your alienation without resisting it, that you accept the fragility of your survival as though it were the natural order of things. But there is nothing natural about a world where wealth rises in proportion to the worker's misery, where progress elevates only those who stand above the laboring masses, and where the very people who create the foundation of society are rendered invisible within it. This silence is not accidental. It is engineered. From the moment you enter the workplace, you are taught the value of obedience. The rules of production demand discipline, not discussion. The rhythm of the factory or office dictates your movements, your hours, your energy. You become part of a process whose purpose is not your well-being, but the expansion of profit. And yet you are expected to remain quiet, to never question why your labor enriches those who do none, to never ask why the product of your work becomes the property of someone else the moment it is completed. Silence, in this system, is the foundation of domination. Without it, the veil covering the true relations of power would fall instantly. Consider the way ideology shapes your perception. You are told that effort leads to reward, that success depends on personal ambition, that the marketplace is free and fair. But these are not truths, they are instruments. They convert your silence into consent. They mask exploitation as opportunity and render suffering as personal failure rather than structural design. Through this ideological machinery, the system does not need to command your silence. It convinces you to enforce it upon yourself. But beneath this stillness lies a deeper contradiction. The entire structure of society rests upon your labor, yet the system insists that your voice holds no weight. It demands your productivity, but not your consciousness. It requires your physical presence while suppressing your political and economic agency. It extracts your time, your energy, your creativity, and your life's best years, yet denies you the dignity of questioning the conditions under which these things are taken. This silence turns human beings into commodities. It transforms the worker's capacity to labor into a purchasable object, stripped of autonomy and sold on the market like any other product. It reduces the infinite potential of human creativity to a mere tool of accumulation. And the more silent you remain, the more easily the system can continue this conversion. But silence is a burden that grows heavier with each passing day. You feel it in the exhaustion that refuses to leave your bones. You feel it in the wages that never match the rising cost of living. You feel it when you watch your children inherit a world where they, too, must sell their labor simply to survive. You feel it when you recognize that the richer the ruling class becomes, the harder your own life grows. This contradiction reveals itself in every aspect of society. You are encouraged to entertain yourself rather than question. You are pushed to compete with your fellow workers rather than unite with them. You are told to focus on individual advancement while the structures controlling your existence remain untouched, unchallenged, and unexposed. The silence of the working class is the lifeblood of the ruling class, and yet silence holds within it the seeds of its own destruction. Because even though the system thrives on your quiet obedience, it also fears the moment when the worker begins to speak. For speech is not simply sound, it is awareness. It is the awakening of consciousness. It is the recognition that the world you build should never belong to those who take no part in its creation. When silence is broken, the system is exposed. When the worker names his condition, exploitation can no longer hide behind the language of opportunity and progress. When the oppressed speak, the foundations of the existing order begin to tremble. For the first time, the worker sees clearly the structures of capital require not only labor to function, they require submission. And submission is maintained only through the silence of those whose strength is far greater than the rulers who profit from it. Comrades, understand this. The system survives because you remain quiet. It ends the moment you refuse to be. Class struggle is not an abstract idea, nor a philosophical speculation invented in the quiet corners of academic halls. It is the beating pulse of human history. It is the conflict that has shaped every social transformation, every revolution, every collapse of old orders and rise of new ones. Long before anyone gave it a name, it was already at work, moving silently beneath the surface of society, compelling change, undermining the illusions of harmony that ruling classes try to impose. To understand history without understanding class struggle is to read a text with its central chapter missing. For the entire development of civilization has been marked by a constant antagonism between those who labor and those who appropriate the fruits of that labor. This antagonism is not rooted in personality or individual morality. It arises from the material organization of society itself, from who owns and who works, who commands and who obeys, who produces and who profits. From the earliest formations of settled life, this division emerged. As soon as private property separated a minority from the majority, a new conflict was born. This conflict did not remain stagnant. It evolved with the advancement of tools, technology, and modes of production. Every age produced its own ruling class and its own oppressed class, slave and master, serf and lord, artisan and guild elite, laborer and industrial capitalist. Though the names have changed, the reality has not. The powerful extract, the powerless endure. Class struggle is not symmetrical. It is not a polite disagreement between equal sides. The ruling class has always possessed the means to hide its dominance through ideology, law, religion, and the control of resources. They cultivate myths of natural order, divine favor, meritocratic success, or national unity to obscure the fact that their position rests upon the subordination of the very people who make society function. The oppressed, on the other hand, begin their struggle from a position of deprivation. They have only their labor power, their bodies, their time, and their collective strength. Their condition pushes them toward resistance, for their survival depends on challenging the structures that exploit them. Their awakening is not optional, it is historical necessity. This is why class struggle is the engine of history. Every ruling class attempts to preserve the conditions of its privilege, while every oppressed class is driven by material reality to resist, revolt, and reshape the world. Revolution is not a romantic ideal, it is the inevitable result of contradictions that become too intense to be contained. Consider how each era ended. The ancient world collapsed when the mass of slaves could no longer sustain an economy built entirely on their exploitation. Feudalism crumbled when peasants and serfs refused to remain bound to land they cultivated but did not own. And capitalism, too, is built upon contradictions that sharpen with each generation, contradictions between the global wealth it amasses and the deepening poverty it imposes on those who create that wealth. In each epoch, the oppressed class becomes the force that pushes humanity into a new stage of development, not because they wish to carry the world forward, but because their very survival demands it. The ruling classes, in contrast, have never advanced society willingly. They cling to old forms long after those forms have become detrimental to human progress. Class struggle is also the struggle for consciousness. The oppressed must come to see that their condition is not personal failure, not an individual fate, but the outcome of a system designed to keep them subservient. The rulers rely on the workers' isolation, their belief in competition, their fear of speaking out. These illusions must be shattered before genuine struggle can begin. Once the oppressed recognize themselves as a class, once they understand that their suffering is shared, their interests aligned, their power collective then-class struggle moves from the background of history to the forefront. At this moment, it ceases to be a silent force and becomes a conscious movement. It becomes organized, deliberate, revolutionary. This awakening is the terror of every ruling class, for they know that numbers are not on their side. The wealth of the few is built upon the labor of the many. The authority of the few is sustained by the obedience of the many. The surplus enjoyed by the few is created by the sacrifices of the many. When the majority unites and acts, the minority that rules cannot stand. The law of history is not written by kings, governments, or capitalists. It is written by the masses who rise when oppression becomes intolerable. The oppressed create the new world in the struggle to free themselves from the old one. And each victory of a laboring class over its rulers, whether through revolt, reform, or revolution, has pushed humanity closer to a society where exploitation can no longer anchor itself in the foundations of life. Thus, class struggle is not an idea imposed upon history, it is history itself. It is the continuous battle between domination and liberation, between exploitation and autonomy, between those who produce the world and those who merely possess it. And as long as society is divided between those who work and those who profit from that work, this struggle will endure until the forces of labor rise to claim the future that rightfully belongs to them. The worker stands at the center of society's entire economic structure, yet remains pushed to its very edges. Every factory that hums with life, every machine that turns raw material into usable goods, every service that sustains daily existence, all of these depend entirely on the laboring hands of workers. Without them, production stops, circulation freezes, and society collapses into stillness. Yet despite being the source of all wealth, the worker receives only the bare minimum required to continue working. This contradiction is not incidental. It is the defining feature of the economic order. The creation of wealth is often portrayed as the result of innovation, entrepreneurial spirit, or the genius of those who organize production. But strip away these ideological illusions, and a simple truth becomes unmistakable. Nothing of value comes into the world without labor. Land yields nothing unless tilled. Machines remain lifeless until operated. Resources stay useless until shaped. For all the marvels of technology and industry, it is the worker who animates them, who gives them meaning, who transforms potential into reality. And yet, in a world where labor is the source of wealth, laborers live perpetually on the edge of deprivation. Their wages are calculated not by the value they create, but by the cost required to maintain them as functioning producers. They receive not what their work is worth, but what the system determines they need to survive another day of work. The immense surplus they generate flows upward, accumulating in the hands of those who do not labor, who do not produce, who do not suffer the exhaustion, repetition, and strain that production demands. This is not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Its logic demands that the worker's share remain minimal, because profit is nothing more than the unpaid labor of the worker. The more profit a capitalist seeks, the more vigorously he must minimize the worker's compensation. This simple equation fuels the entire machinery of exploitation. To increase wealth at the top, the bottom must be squeezed, disciplined, monitored, and kept docile. The worker's productivity expands with every new invention, every technological upgrade, every rationalization of labor. One worker today can accomplish what once required dozens. Yet as productivity rises, wages do not rise with it. Instead, the opposite occurs. The more efficiently the worker produces, the smaller his relative share becomes. His labor becomes cheaper as his output grows, deepening the very inequality that his work was supposed to alleviate. This paradox reveals a brutal truth. The worker's own achievements become instruments of his exploitation. The machinery that was meant to free humanity from toil becomes the very tool that intensifies his oppression. The system invests in technology not to improve the worker's life, but to control him, to reduce his bargaining power, to make him replaceable, to ensure that the wealth he creates continues to bypass him entirely. Meanwhile, those who claim ownership over the means of production enjoy lives of comfort and security built entirely on the labor of others. Their wealth grows automatically, without sweat or sacrifice, because they possess what the worker lacks: the power to command labor. Their property gives them dominion over production, and through this dominion they appropriate the surplus that the worker generates. The more the worker produces, the richer they become. The worker, however, cannot escape this cycle. To live, he must sell his labor power. He enters the marketplace as a necessity, not as an equal participant. His only commodity is his ability to work, and he must exchange it under conditions he does not control. Every hour he spends in service to production is an hour in which he enriches someone else far more than himself. Yet this condition is hidden beneath layers of ideology. The worker is told that he is paid fairly, that the marketplace rewards him for his contribution, that opportunity awaits anyone willing to work hard. But these narratives collapse upon examination. If effort alone determined reward, no worker would live in poverty, and no idle owner would accumulate wealth. If fairness governed the system, the producer of wealth would not live in scarcity while the non-producer lived in abundance. The contradiction between the worker's contribution and the worker's compensation is not merely economic, it is moral, political, and historical. It exposes the fundamental injustice at the heart of modern society. The producer is denied the product. The creator is denied the creation. The hands that build the world receive only what is necessary to keep building it. Yet within this contradiction lies the seed of transformation. For when the worker recognizes the magnitude of his contribution and the extent of what is taken from him, he begins to understand his true power. He sees that the wealth of the world is his own labor made material, that the towers of industry, the markets of trade, the networks of circulation, all of it rests upon his effort. And once he sees this, the illusion of his powerlessness begins to dissolve. The worker produces all wealth. The worker receives the least from it. And this simple truth demands not resignation but awakening. There are moments in history when the world seems immovable, when the structures of power appear permanent, when oppression feels eternal, when the rulers believe they have secured their dominance for all time. Yet beneath the surface of every such era, a force waits quietly, gathering strength, preparing to erupt. That force is the collective will of the workers. For when workers unite, history itself begins to shift. The seemingly unchangeable becomes fragile, and the mighty foundations of society begin to tremble. In ordinary times, the worker stands isolated. Each individual faces the power of the ruling class alone, negotiating wages alone, suffering exploitation alone, and confronting the immense machinery of the system without allies beside him. This isolation weakens him. It convinces him that his struggle is personal rather than systemic, that his misery results from personal failure or bad fortune rather than the structural design of the economic order. The system depends on this loneliness. It cultivates competition among workers, turning them against one another, fragmenting their strength, preventing them from discovering the power that lies dormant within their unity. But the moment workers recognize that their conditions are shared, that their exploitation is not individual but collective, a profound transformation occurs. The worker begins to see himself not as a solitary laborer, but as part of a class. And once this consciousness emerges, isolation dissolves, and unity becomes possible. This unity is not sentimental. It is not built on abstract goodwill. It arises from material reality, from the shared experience of selling labor, of being appropriated, of living at the mercy of those who control the means of production. Workers are bound together by the very conditions that oppress them, and these conditions compel them towards solidarity. The more intense the exploitation, the clearer the necessity of unity becomes. When workers unite, they do not merely add their voices together, they magnify their power exponentially. A single worker refusing to obey can be threatened or replaced. 100 can be disciplined. But when thousands stand together, the system falters. Production slows, supply chains break, the accumulation of wealth halts. The ruling class, accustomed to commanding labor as though it were a natural resource, suddenly discovers that its authority is an illusion, dependent entirely on the cooperation of those it exploits. It is in these moments that history moves. The transformation wrought by unified workers is not limited to economic struggle. Their unity challenges the very structure of social relations. A strike is not merely a demand for higher wages, it is a declaration that workers are not commodities, but human beings with agency and rights. A mass movement of labourers is not simply a protest, it is a reassertion of dignity, a rejection of subordination, a statement that society belongs to those who build it. Every significant leap in human progress has been driven by this force. The end of feudalism was not gifted by the ruling class, it was seized by peasants who banded together against the power of the lords. The rights won during the industrial age did not emerge from the generosity of employers, but from the coordinated struggle of workers who organized themselves into unions, councils, and movements. Every protection enjoyed today, limits on working hours, safety standards, collective bargaining rights, was forged through the unity of labor, resisting the demands of capital. The ruling class understands this power, even if workers do not always recognize it themselves. This is why they long ago learned to suppress unity by any means necessary. They create divisions based on skill level, nationality, race, gender, manufacturing differences to weaken solidarity. They promote the illusion of individual success, convincing workers that they must compete against one another for survival. They glorify the myth of the self-made individual so that workers blame themselves for their suffering instead of identifying their shared exploitation. Yet despite all efforts to prevent it, the drive toward unity persists. It emerges again and again, each time the exploitation becomes unbearable, each time the contradictions of the system tighten, each time workers realize that they have nothing left to lose except the conditions that bind them. When workers unite, they reclaim their voice, they reclaim their agency, they reclaim the world that has been built by their hands but controlled by others. This unity is the great nightmare of every ruling class, for they know that their wealth, their power, their comfort, all of it depends on the continued obedience of those who labor. Should that obedience end, the entire system begins to crumble. The palaces of privilege shake not because of violence, but because the foundation beneath them, the workers, have withdrawn their support. History moves not when rulers decree it, but when workers act. For the true force of change has always belonged to the laboring masses. Their unity is the spark that ignites transformation, the engine that drives revolution, the force that breaks the illusion of permanence surrounding oppressive systems. And as long as workers continue to unite, the tide of history will always move toward liberation, reshaping the world in the image of those who create it. There comes a moment in the life of every oppressed class, when confusion gives way to clarity, when resignation gives way to anger, when silence becomes unbearable, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of ideology, finally breaks through. This moment is the awakening, a profound rupture in consciousness, where the worker no longer sees himself as a powerless instrument, but as the driving force of society. It is the beginning of reclamation, the first spark of transformation, the instant when centuries of subordination begin to unravel. Awakening does not arrive gently. It does not whisper. It strikes with the weight of lived reality. It emerges from the fatigue that settles deep in the bones after years of labor. It arises from the realization that no matter how hard one works, the promise of security remains perpetually out of reach. It grows out of the contradiction between the wealth one creates and the poverty one endures. And when this contradiction becomes too sharp to ignore, the worker begins to question, first quietly, then openly, and finally with a voice that can no longer be silenced. This awakening is the greatest threat to any system built on exploitation. For as long as the worker remains unconscious of his own power, the ruling class enjoys dominion without challenge. They rely on his obedience, his isolation, his belief in the illusion that his life is determined by individual fate rather than collective circumstance. They depend on his internalization of failure, on the false narrative that if he struggles, it is because he is not worthy or capable enough. But when consciousness breaks through, the myth shatters. The worker begins to see that his suffering is not personal, it is structural. He recognizes that the system was never designed for his benefit, that its promises of upward mobility and individual opportunity serve only to conceal its true purpose, the extraction of labor for someone else's gain. This revelation is not merely intellectual, it is existential. It frees the worker from the chains of self-blame and redirects his anger toward the real source of his oppression. Awakening is not a passive state of awareness. It is action waiting to be unleashed. It is the understanding that the worker's obedience is the foundation upon which exploitation stands, and that withholding this obedience is the beginning of liberation. It is the realization that production halts without his hands, that society stalls without his labor, that wealth evaporates without his effort. In this moment of awakening, the worker no longer sees himself as small. He sees himself as essential. Every building, every bridge, every source of energy, every manufactured good, every line of code, every field of crops, every service that sustains life, all of it is created by those who work. The world is built not by the wealthy, not by the owners, not by those who give orders from lofty offices, but by those who rise every morning to exert their bodies, minds, and time in the service of production. When the worker understands this, a profound transformation occurs. He begins to reclaim what has always been his: power. This reclamation is not merely economic, it is human. It restores dignity stolen by years of subjugation. It revives dreams suffocated by long hours and meager wages. It reignites the belief that life can be more than survival under the control of others. The ruling class trembles at this awakening because it reveals their dependence. They present themselves as the architects of civilization, yet they create nothing. Their wealth grows while they sleep, while the worker labors, while society functions on the sweat of those whose names they do not bother to learn. When workers awaken, the ruling class is exposed as parasitic, clinging to power built entirely on the labor they neither respect nor understand. Awakening also reveals the necessity of unity. For while one conscious worker may resist, a class of conscious workers can transform the world. This is the political heart of awakening. It compels workers to recognize their shared condition, their shared exploitation, their shared destiny. It destroys the illusion of competition and replaces it with solidarity. It shifts the worker's gaze from individual survival to collective liberation. Reclaiming power means reclaiming the means of shaping society. It means asserting that those who produce the wealth must also direct its use. It means demanding control over the conditions of labor, over the distribution of resources, over the decisions that determine the course of human life. It means refusing to be a mere instrument and becoming a historical actor. Once awakened, the worker cannot return to sleep. He cannot unsee the truth. He cannot willingly accept the chains he now understands he forged through his own submission. This awakening is not the end, it is the beginning of resistance, the beginning of organization, the beginning of transformation. For when the worker awakens, he steps into his rightful role not as a servant of the system, but as its creator and, ultimately, its liberator. The moment has arrived when hesitation becomes a form of surrender and silence becomes an accomplice to oppression. No system built on the subjugation of the many by the few collapses on its own. It must be confronted by conscious, organized, and determined human beings who recognize the chains that bind them and refuse to bear them any longer. The call to action is not a poetic invitation, nor a philosophical abstraction. It is a historical necessity born from the very conditions that govern everyday life. For too long, the workers of the world have been conditioned to accept exploitation as natural, inequality as inevitable, and powerlessness as permanent. But history shows that nothing is permanent except struggle itself, struggle that transforms, struggle that liberates, struggle that demands participation. In every factory, every field, every office, and every digital workspace, the producers of wealth stand at a crossroads. On one path lies continued submission to forces that drain their strength, consume their time, and reward them with barely enough to survive. On the other path lies rebellion, not chaos, but organized resistance rooted in clarity, purpose, and solidarity. The first path leads only to deeper poverty disguised as opportunity, deeper isolation disguised as competition, deeper despair disguised as aspiration. The second path leads to collective power, shared ownership, and a society finally aligned with human dignity rather than private profit. The call to action does not arise from lofty ideals alone. It arises from the material contradictions of the present order. Every worker who toils longer than ever, yet feels more insecure than ever, already senses that something is fundamentally wrong. Every laborer who produces wealth they will never own knows, even if silently, that injustice is woven into the very fabric of economic life. Every individual who feels their labor reduced to a commodity, valued only in terms of profit, understands the cold machinery designed to strip them of humanity. These realizations are not isolated, they are the seeds of consciousness, the first sparks of collective awakening. But sparks alone cannot illuminate the world. They must become a flame. Action begins with recognition. Recognition that power does not reside in the fortress of the ruling class alone, but in the hands of those whose labor sustains the entire social structure. When workers refuse to comply, production halts. When workers organize, exploitation trembles. When workers unite across divisions imposed to weaken them, race, nationality, gender, industry, the foundations of inequality shake. The ruling class fears not the individual worker, but the organized mass that understands its strength. That understanding is the weapon the oppressed have been denied through misinformation, division, and ceaseless struggle to merely survive. Yet once this understanding emerges, it cannot be undone. Still, knowledge without action becomes another form of resignation. It is not enough to see the injustice, one must confront it. It is not enough to curse exploitation, one must dismantle it. It is not enough to dream of a better world, one must build it. This is why the call to action demands more than outrage, it demands organization. Only through collective structures, unions, councils, revolutionary groups, and movements rooted in democratic participation can the working class exert real force. Without organization, anger becomes noise. With organization, anger becomes history. The world has reached a stage where the contradictions of the system are no longer hidden behind promises of opportunity or illusions of mobility. Inequality has become too blatant, exploitation too visible, alienation too widespread. The old order can no longer pretend to serve the interests of the many. It serves only its own survival. And any system that survives by suppressing the majority is a system destined to fall. The question is not whether it will fall, but whether the oppressed will shape what comes next or allow a new form of domination to take its place. Thus, the call to action is not a plea, it is an obligation. An obligation to those who came before, who fought and endured so that progress was even possible. An obligation to those alive today, trapped in economic structures that treat human beings as expendable. And an obligation to those who will inherit the future, who deserve a world built not on exploitation, but on cooperation, equality, and shared prosperity. Rise not as isolated individuals, but as a unified force. Rise not with blind fury, but with disciplined purpose. Rise not for temporary relief, but for permanent transformation. The moment has come to seize the power that rightfully belongs to those who build the world with their labor. The moment has come to stand, to organize, to act. The call has been made. The choice now belongs to you. Comrades? The power of the worker has never been a dream of the future. It has always been a truth of the present, disguised behind exploitation, alienation, and the ideology of the ruling class. Awaken the giant within you. Awaken the consciousness history demands of you. Awaken the strength that no capital, no government, no ruling order can suppress once it stands united. The world you build must become the world you own. The society you sustain must become the society that sustains you. The future of humanity depends upon the awakening of its true creators. The workers, the oppressed, the exploited, the many. Rise, organize, unite, and reclaim the destiny that is rightfully yours.